Thank you, Isla. It's a pleasure to be here, and I feel like I'm standing between you and this incredible World Series celebration. So it's the first time I've ever had to compete with the World Series, and I'm flattered that this many people tore themselves away from the game to listen to me. I'm also fully prepared to be interrupted in whatever, about 30 minutes for some huge celebration. So. All right. It's also a pleasure to be here in San Francisco. I mean, it's certainly a city with a really strong architectural tradition. Isla mentioned the field conditions piece and the importance in that work of questions of representation and in particular the issue of the diagram. And I'm going to be showing work of various scales tonight, and it seemed like the best way to tie all that together was by thinking about the way in which that work is made. One of the things it seems to me that is sort of worthwhile in seeing a lecture is not only having a kind of review of the projects, but a little bit of insight into the thinking behind them. So. The sort of day-to-day conversation in the studio and the means by which these things are developed and visualized, of course, has an impact on the project. And I would begin by insisting that as much as architecture is devoted to intervening in the world, to the construction of something that's solid and material and lasting, the way we get to that is through highly abstract means, through drawings and representations that are themselves have an internal logic and work through abstract notational codes. Even an architect as so strongly associated with materiality as Louis Kahn would seem to me that doesn't that laser pointer showing up? Well. I don't necessarily need to point. I mean, in the image on the right, for example, the way in which the graphic pattern of the stone is registered, and even you could say the kind of I mean, I'm fully willing to be convinced that the upper part of this arch is operating according to a tectonic logic, but not necessarily the lower part. So. There's a very strong impact of the representational means, and in part it of course has to do with the question of scale. This wonderful drawing of the full-size elevation of the cathedral, which would then be projected up in space, or the guys on the right who are lofting full-scale aircraft components. Of course, we know we can't draw a building one-to-one. But also the abstraction of these visualization means allows us both to think about program and event and to organize complex programmatic conjunctions. So again, I mean, to use another example from Kahn, the way in which he understood the city of Philadelphia, not in terms of the built fabric of the blocks, but in terms of the movement vectors of the streets of Philadelphia in this famous diagram. I think diagrams also have another capacity, which is to clarify and explain both organizational principles, as you see on the drawing on the right, again through questions of repetition, symmetry, mirroring, or in the famous sketch by Le Corbusier, where he explains the concepts of the free plan. Again, there are sort of generalizable compositional rules that are teased out by means of the diagram. This seems to me it's all the more urgent in the present, where through these very powerful design tools, we can work as much on the kind of codes underlying material form and organization, saying this node, for example, is connected to that node, as opposed to visualizing the final form. It's one of my favorite diagrams. That's what happens to a spider on speed. And of course, what's being messed with here is the code. And you could say almost the sort of diagrammatic organization of the web has been messed with from the inside out. What's changed in a way is the code, is the diagram. There's another aspect, though, of diagram work which interests me, which is the ability of the diagram to create a kind of immediacy and a kind of freshness to the work. This is the sculptor Tony Smith, trained as an architect, by the way, and one of his realized works, and on the lower right, some of the maquettes that he would make in preparation for doing these pieces. Tony Smith didn't have a studio. He didn't work in the traditional way of a sculptor of sort of carving stone or molding clay. He worked with a series of geometrical relationships which he could visualize with these maquettes, which were then translated into the full-scale work. Tony Smith very famously, one of these early pieces of his that anticipated minimalism, simply called up a steel fabricator and said, "Make me a cube 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet." So again, what he was dealing with was a series of rules, you could say almost algorithms, in this case a very simple algorithm, albeit, to create this diagrammatic relationship of form. Here's a slightly more complex algorithm. This is a wall drawing by Sol LeWitt. If you're a museum or an art collector, more likely a museum if it's a Sol LeWitt, and you want to buy the Sol LeWitt piece of art, you don't buy the wall, you don't buy the material of the work. What you buy is the diagram. And this is, you can see on the left, the certificate which authenticates the work. And if you were to buy this work, you basically buy the right to have it installed on a wall. And if you have a long, skinny wall, you get a long, skinny Sol LeWitt. If you have a tall, fat wall, you'll get a tall, fat Sol LeWitt. So again, this blurring between the physicality of the work and the diagrammatic organization of that work. This is a piece from around the same time by Mel Bachner. And again, is it a piece of art or a diagram? I mean, it's really blurring the boundaries and existing in both realms. So there's something about that kind of the immediacy of those relationships that a number of people have picked up and translated into architecture, trying to capture a similar sense of not necessarily a building which is produced by means of diagrams, but a building that operates like a diagram. This is an early piece by the British sculptor Tony Craig, no longer extant. I think it was no longer extant about 3 seconds after the photograph was taken. But in a kind of extreme case, this sort of underlines the sort of ephemerality of this diagram-based work. So let me show very quickly one project of ours that was trying to work with a similar logic. This is a study for an exhibition pavilion, which I'm actually going to show. It's being built in a very, very different form, and I will show the final version later. But as we started to work on it, actually this diagram, can everybody still hear me? This diagram in the upper left was actually something we had worked with in a small building a number of years ago, where 2 points of structure were defined and then a series of walls that could kind of rotate. It was something I always wanted to revisit and realize that you could set up this simple rule-based operation that could then generate a number of different configurations. And of course, while that's happening, we're also thinking about the actual form of the building and the way it might develop. We worked with a programmer and actually scripted the set of rules, and he wrote us a script which was essentially generating an infinite number of possibilities following that simple set of rules. 3 points and then 6 lines that sweep to the perimeter. And then also you can see that we've alternated the figure ground conditions, which then in turn gave us a kind of pretext for reading this from a programmatic point of view, which would then allow us to develop it as a fully realized piece of architecture. So, so you see those. This is 2,500 variations, again, generated almost randomly. But then, we don't expect the computer to do the work for us. That was generating possible plan configurations, which then we would return to with a kind of artificial intelligence and read it both, for example, because of the common points in the center, all of the structural loads are transferred very, very efficiently down to the ground, and then with that same figure ground reversal, so that basically the lower floor has kind of entry and check-in, the large area in the center of the second floor would be exhibition, and then on the top floor we would have overlook terraces, which were part of the program. So there's what the study model of that project looked like. So this notion of the diagram work really helps us to move between all of the different scales of work in the office. From the that's an image of a house that was built in LA almost 10 years ago, and a competition project there on the right. I would argue, however, that with the larger scale projects, these questions become a little bit more complicated. They've become complicated and urgent for two reasons. First of all, with the larger scale work, in many cases you're dealing with large collaborative teams. So if you have to fight out every formal decision that's made over the course of the project, you're never going to be able to move the project forward. What we find when we work in these large-scale teams is if you can agree on the diagram at the beginning, then the development of the project over time becomes easier and easier, and the communication among everybody on the team becomes easier. But also, as you begin to work with larger, more complex programs, the number of variables are increased, and you need the diagram to play a kind of synthetic role where, again, you're not solving individual problems as they arise, but you have some sort of diagrammatic basis to turn to. And certainly the field conditions work that I did back in the middle of the 1990s was in some ways all about toggling back and forth between the abstract diagrammatic character. The drawings on the right are by the post-minimalist artist Barry LeVay, but and the reindeer herd on the left, which is responding to the presence of a helicopter. Again, you could say this is nature behaving like a diagram, and in fact, nature does that more than you think. So these were some of the diagrams that we used. Again, talking about some of the basic organizing principles. If in this case the ones to your left represent the more traditional top-down organizational principles where large programmatic elements are moved around into different compositional relationships, whereas the ones on the right, operating more like things like the flocking diagrams, locate difference locally and maintain a fairly coherent notion of the whole. This is the kind of thing we've used, again, in smaller scale projects with repetitive units. This was a prototype school project, and here you see, again, some of the combinatory rules, and then the final plan with the classrooms, public spaces, service spaces, and courtyards. And of course, the field conditions was also kind of the hinge point as I began to think about the relationship between urbanism and architecture and landscape. So that again, in a sense, one of the kind of founding insights of landscape urbanism is that the natural landscape, or natural in quotation marks, by the way, the desert landscape above and the urban landscape below are actually operating according to very, very similar rules. In both cases, you have patterns that are laid down over a fundamentally horizontal field that are then controlling the development and the behavior of that assemblage or ecology over time. So that in fact we can say that in this case the desert outside of Los Angeles and Los Angeles itself are operating according to the pattern set down by a kind of visible and invisible infrastructures embedded into that landscape. So it's information embedded into that landscape. Yeah, not to kind of dwell on the codification of all of that within landscape urbanism, but again to underline the fact that with these large-scale collaborative projects, the working diagrams become a key component in the day-to-day discussion in the studio and in the field. So the ability of those diagrams to communicate very telegraphically and to describe formal relationships and organizational relationships is really key to working with these large-scale complex sites. So in this example, where we're contrasting the kind of singular focus of the traditional outdoor amphitheater with this notion of a kind of multi-centered event landscape project we did in Taichung about 5 years ago. All right, so with the diagram playing a kind of unifying role then, we can talk about the projects that we work on in the studio rather than thinking of them as architecture or landscape or urbanism or focusing on the differences in scale, to think about territories, systems, and objects. So I want to start with the larger scale, work down through some of the smaller scale work, and actually return to a slightly larger scale project. So these are three projects that really come out of the landscape urbanism experience. The first of which that Isla had mentioned for the what's become known as the Taichung Gateway Park. The city of Taichung is about Taipei is the second largest city in Taiwan, and is now reached by high-speed railroad from Taipei. And you can see here the historic center of the city. We won this competition to look at the site of the former municipal airport. It had been here since the 1940s. The city had grown up to encompass the airport. A new airport was built further out from town, leaving a 240 hectare, that's about 600-acre site, about as close as you can get today to a pure tabula rasa. Dead flat from end to end, and pretty much empty of buildings. So tremendous opportunity to work on this site, to really plan a fragment of the city from scratch, but some serious issues to deal with. Of course, it had no real identity in the minds of the citizens of Taichung. It was totally undifferentiated from end to end, and of course completely cut off from the city. So in trying to knit this new piece of city back into the city fabric, we wanted to look on the one hand at the presence of the natural system, a river that existed at the edge of the city, and the idea of trying to pull those green spaces really into the heart of the city, because some of these Asian cities actually are very lacking in green space. And of course, we wanted to respect the radial structure of the city as it's been grown up over time. So our initial scheme was also very much motivated by strategic concerns. This is a real project. It's moving forward into implementation, and we knew that the city could control open space and roadways. At the end of the day, they weren't going to have a lot of control over the building fabric, which would of necessity be built by other architects and developers. So the first scheme took the roadway, which had to go through the site, and by bending it into a series of S-curves, carved out a large green space in the center of the city, which we could then design with a fairly high degree of specificity, and then let the city grow up to that new figure, erasing the old boundary of the airport and leaving that new void as the defining identity for the city. And the argument here is that because it's going to take 15 or 20 years to build out this site, and we don't know what's going to happen to technology, we don't know what's going to happen with the economy, there's an intrinsic flexibility to this scheme, provided that basic framework is maintained. Turned out the mayor loved our scheme, but he said, well, I promised the people of Taichung a park, not a road. So we pulled the road out of the park, and that's where this diagram comes from. The road now weaves in and out from the built fabric to the park. And this is the organizing diagram both for the new geometry of the park, which is based on water collection, and also proposes to capture and recycle the runoff from the surrounding neighborhood. So this is the final working plan. You can see that the figure has changed its geometry slightly. You can see the roadway now moving actually through the fabric as well as through the park, and the way in which the new fabric is sort of coming from the lots of existing and helping to define that new figure. You see that a little bit better here with the different neighborhoods and the strong figure of the park itself. So the park itself, I mean, again, this is still in preliminary stages, but there's a certain amount of thinking about the park itself, about the programming of that park, about the geometries, about the presence. We've even worked with the landscape architect just with a preliminary planting proposal. But we recognize that with the surrounding fabric, there will be a much looser degree of control. So this notion that we can only loosely map the density that will be constructed in these four neighborhoods that are kind of carved out from the plan itself. Of course, we do utilize some of the traditional tools of urban design. We actually studied the typologies typical to Taichung, and then we use the traditional tools of zoning and design guidelines to steer the development in those new sites, but knowing we can only steer it loosely. I would say in a fairly polemical way, not something most of my friends and colleagues want to hear, but if this is a piece of landscape urbanism, this is not so distant from new urbanism, and we can kind of accept that use of different kinds of tools within the project, because there's a kind of pragmatic logic about thinking strategically to get the thing implemented. What complicates that binary relationship are a series of large-scale buildings at the north end of the site that are really intended to function like a kind of gateway, like a kind of landmark. These three towers that will move in space as you move along the ring road of the city, and a series of fairly monumental programs that nonetheless still try and weave together the city and the park. So this is an office tower, hotel, small dome stadium, transportation hub, and the bridge piece here is the convention center. And all of this is very much a kind of infrastructural thinking with parking and services and movement, which then gets kind of woven into the logic of the park itself. So you see the three towers that are visible from the highway, and the convention center bridge that not only has a kind of green roof on the top, but is lifted up to allow the park to slip in underneath. Our Taichung contact moved up to Taipei in the recent election, and we were asked to look at another site in Taipei, the Yangping waterfront. For those of you who know Taipei, the 101 Tower is over there somewhere. The new urban design corridor, the central railway station is here, which will sort of terminate at this waterfront park. It's about 2 kilometers long, and it also includes one inboard site where there was an existing parking garage. So, all very well and good to make a waterfront park, but we have to deal with this monster. Because of the monsoons and the danger of flooding in the 1960s, this flood control wall, which is over 8 meters high, has been constructed along all of the waterfront edges of Taipei. So again, this is a really good example of a kind of underlying diagram that both has a kind of flexibility but is also determinant in the entire project. Our proposal, instead of having a single dividing wall which would separate the city from the waterfront park, our proposal argues that we can maintain the same level of flood control protection with a landform that we could shape freely, both to allow smooth access from the city to the park, but also to manipulate it in plan as well, which both improves the natural ecologies of the site by creating a more serrated edge towards the waterfront, but it also improves, if you will, the social ecologies, the program ecologies of the site by creating new programmatic opportunities. So this is an aerial view of the proposal, and you can see the way in which the crest of the wall, the crest of the landform, moves in and out, bringing the water close to the city and pushing the parkland further out. There's another important thing. Everything outboard of the wall is subject to flooding and therefore can only be hardscape or native planted. So when moments like this, where the crest of the wall is pushed further out, allow us to have a different palette of landscape materials than would ever be possible if we were still working with the danger of flooding. So here you see the red line is the crest of the wall. So you can see the soft landscapes that are protected, that are inboard of the wall, and the hard landscapes that are outboard of the wall, and then a series of programs that are tucked into the section of the wall itself. The obligatory diagrams about travel circles and parking, and the final working version of the plan. You can see that we develop a large public space here at the end of that particular corridor, and then business programs more with environmental functions and the more active recreation into the north. So you see here, for example, that using the depth of that section, we can work things like parking into the park without having the kind of presence of a strong piece of architecture. Or here, where we sort of reorient looking back to the city and create a major public space. I mentioned that we had one inboard site, and we take, in a sense, the pathway of the crest and wrap it up around itself to kind of create a vertical expression, kind of iconic presence of the park on the waterfront that would be the kind of counterpoint to the horizontality of the park itself. So with this loose net around a series of programs, some of which we were proposing an aviary at the top of the building to really bring the presence of the park right into the city and then up vertically. So then the third of these larger scale landscape projects. This one was for a site in Korea. We were among 6 architects. Well, actually, we were the only architects, 5 landscape architectural firms and us, to make proposals for a site around these 2 reservoirs, both man-made lakes. This is a site about 20 or 30 kilometers south of Seoul. And our response to this particular site, again, had to do with questions of identity and questions of strategic implementation. For us, the problem in this particular site, the issue of this particular competition, is how could you possibly make a park that, on the one hand, will have a sense of identity, a sense of place, in what's really this kind of diffuse and uneven kind of existing landscape, I would, it seems to me, it's pretty hard to argue that if we hadn't drawn a yellow line around the site, there's no way of knowing, say, that's in the park and that's outside of the park. So there was no sense of the park having any kind of natural or even artificial boundary. And this park is intended to be part of a very large-scale development. Who knows whether it's moving forward or not with the recession, but the MDRDB project right here, and all around this western edge of this particular lake, very, very large-scale commercial development is proposed. So in one sense, the question is, how can landscape compete with that very, very aggressive and frankly fairly banal presence of large-scale commercial development that's so characteristic in the Asian city today? So the option available, say, to a landscape architect like Olmsted, of defining the park as a kind of green void within the continuous fabric of the city is just simply not available to us anymore. We don't build cities like this, and we're not given sites like that to work with. So we repurposed this famous iconic image from the 1960s, Hans Holstein's collage of the aircraft carrier in the landscape. And in the 1960s, it was a kind of icon of imposing a technological presence on the landscape. Our argument is that with current design thinking and current technologies, we could do a version of this that is more in sympathy with the landscape as opposed to simply in conflict or contradiction to that landscape. So our proposal, so you see what I mean, all those white towers, we did not design. That is the proposed massing for this very large-scale commercial development that will dominate the southern half of this site. And our proposal consists in a single line that runs the entire length of the site from north to south, traversing both lakes. And as that constructed line moves across the site, it's materialized in different ways in response to the changing conditions of the landscape. And it's also, as we think is nicely illustrated by this diagram, it would tend to get dissolved into the site, blurring the boundary between the hard built structure and the soft landscape structure over time, so that the landscape would partake of the architectural character as much as the architecture would partake of the character of the landscape. Again, this is perhaps more of an example of the ways in which diagrams are used in their explanatory function, but again, this was very much part of our thinking within the office as we were working on it. The first step in creating this strong new identity for the park is a smooth consolidation, so that all of the different programs that were required get concentrated onto this single band. That does two things. First of all, again, in this fairly diffuse environment, our argument is you're more likely to have a successful, well-used park if you create a kind of density of activity along a single line. Also, even though it's apparently a fairly sort of aggressive proposal, by concentrating the active programs on the single line, we're actually able to protect a larger portion of the site that's left over. So that's the second operation, which is the counter operation, which is an ecological operation of protecting, of habitat restoration that of necessity is going to extend past the boundaries of the site. Because ecologies don't respect arbitrary boundaries. Ecologies operate within larger fields. So the logic of the project then is this pier logic plus the field logic. And the pier itself has to be programmed in order to assure that kind of density of activity. And we worked very closely with the landscape architects at James Cohen and Partners to develop an ecological and landscape strategy. So this is another view looking from the southern of the two lakes, again giving us a sense of the proposed future development. The southernmost of these two lakes is close to this commercial development and is intended to be much more active with our floating soccer barge. And then you can see the view up to the northern end where it becomes much more landscape oriented. And then the last point, again, if we're going to propose a structure this extensive, is that structure has to perform some work. It has to do some work in the landscape, do some work on the site. And in particular here, this is the redesigned spillway at the northern most of the two lakes, by extending the spillway and creating an aeration zone here. That water is then filtered and used to irrigate the orchard, and it's also spanning a section here. There's an expressway under there, so we have to filter the exhaust the pollution from the expressway. So this piece of the building itself, as other parts of the building are as well, need to be performing work. All right, so this is the overall plan, again showing the kind of continuity between the landscape surfaces and the built surfaces. The southern end, where this piece here, this boardwalk piece here, connects to the commercial development and would bring people down and into the site at that point. And then the way in which the top of the pier, again, gets shaped and populated, both with the vegetation coming through, but also with active programs. And then, as the topography drops down, these orchard plantings, we create a lighter structure that comes down, so there's a great deal of porosity between the lower level and the upper level. And then as you move into this northern area, there's the section I was talking about with the expressway and the spillway coming in and dropping under. And then moving up into the northernmost of the two lakes with the eco lodge at the top of the hill there, and the pathways through the reeds, not to mention the floating karaoke pavilion, and the notion is right there. Hopefully they don't disturb the bird life. And again, a highly developed planting strategy and habitat restoration strategy. So there would be times in which the architecture is dominant, but many times in which the primary experience of the site is one of landscape with the architecture only in the background. All right. Well, one of the things about these large-scale projects is that they take forever to realize. And this is, in fact, another function of the diagram, that the diagram, in fact, helps to communicate with bureaucracies and public agencies. In this particular, but it also, as an architect, I mean, one of the reasons to work at multiple scales is not only to deal with different issues and different problems, but to deal with different speeds of working and different speeds of realization. As I mentioned, it's probably 10 to 15 years minimum before this site is anything close to being built out. And of course, another thing about working with these large projects is you're dealing with very local, on-the-ground political realities. The mayor who we worked with on this project is term limited. He's leaving office on February 1st. And we started a discussion about 2 years with him saying, look, wouldn't it be nice to have something built on site before you leave office? He liked that idea. We're through the process of appropriating money, and we're now working on the small and quick project, which is an exhibition pavilion, which will be used both to bring people onto the site in a controlled way to see the progress of the construction, but also to raise awareness of the project and to exhibit the drawings of the project. They appropriated money, but they didn't appropriate a lot of money. After looking at quickly, which was that first project I showed you, the possibility of a freestanding pavilion, we realized, and it's actually, by the way, one of the cases in which having less money made the project more interesting. The solution was to build inside one of the hangars. This is actually really quite an incredible space, and also in a way much more in character with the airport site. Of course, it's very heavy concrete slab. They used to drive airplanes onto this, so you can easily build a fairly lightweight pavilion. And of course, it has a roof, so you don't have to worry about waterproofing and keeping the rain out. All of those things that cost a lot of money. So, far from being disappointed, we actually got very, very excited about the prospect of working in this building here, which, as you can see, also has a really good situation relative to the site. Projects like this, of course, were immediate references. This is a project which he's kind of appropriated as his own. It was actually a student project for a concert hall inside one of the Albert Kahn warehouses. But the notion of something sort of lightweight and ephemeral collaged into this industrial context is certainly something that interests us very, very much. Again, working with a fairly limited budget and a quick time of realization also had an impact on the project. First thing we thought of was the ubiquitous use of bamboo scaffolding in Asia. So the proposition of the project is that we use that readily available, known technology, locally available material, also highly green material, completely recyclable, to create a kind of dense weave of bamboo out of which we would carve the sort of platform and the roof for the exhibition. It turns out bamboo scaffolding is actually highly regulated and controlled. You sort of look at it and think it's something that they just sort of make up as they go along, but you can actually become a certified bamboo scaffolding specialist. So we spent a fair amount of time actually understanding the principles and the regulations about bamboo scaffolding. We did run into a bit of a kind of cultural clash when we presented this to our clients in Taiwan. Their response was, well, in Taiwan, we're modern. We use metal scaffolding. So for them, that was like, for the peasants on the mainland or something. So we were able to convince them that it made sense in this particular context. However, we did run up against code issues, and ultimately the raised space of public occupancy had to have a kind of steel structure. So the final version of the project is a kind of composite with a kind of hard shell on the inside, which is wrapped by this very, very thick skin up to 3 meters deep of the bamboo scaffolding, and then skinned with bamboo as well. This is a photograph of the project from about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So you can see the steel structure creating this raised exhibition area and the beginning of the bamboo scaffolding that's wrapping this structure. So this is the plan. You enter through the big hangar doors. There are exhibitions where we repurpose parts of the hangar, and you come around and you enter here, where there are introductory materials, and then coming up on this stair, you reach this large central exhibition area. Within this large kind of amphitheater-like stairway that will bring you up to the balcony overlook that will have the view over the site. And then you can see here the way in which we've used some lightweight trim to kind of shade the bamboo from the inside, but then with a very strong presence of the bamboo on the exterior for the sort of primary kind of like icon of the building really will be the bamboo. And also the optical properties of this scaffolding with the reflections. It's going to be lit from inside. We became experts at detailing bamboo, although there's also, again, a kind of limit to how closely you can design for a material as, let's say, as bamboo. These are more recent photographs, about a week old now at this point, so you can see the form emerging underneath the open doors of the hangar, and the beginning of the skin here. So, for example, one little detail here, we're very happy with this resolution of that joint, where it almost becomes like a kind of stitched fabric. And if you will notice here, in our drawing, we said trim the ends flush. When we built a mock-up, it turned out that this is a much more interesting solution. So this project, well, it will be inaugurated in January in time for the mayor to inaugurate the project before he leaves office. So this, again, there's something very satisfying in a way about that quick form of realization. So this will serve, in a sense, then, to introduce a series of smaller scale projects that, again, touch on different issues, although they're worked through. Actually, the conversations in the office are really very similar around the small projects as the large projects, the exception being that the teams tend to be smaller. Houses do sometimes take a long time to realize as well. This is the house that we finished in Sacramento about 3 years ago. We were part of the 32 architects building essentially sort of prototype weekend houses. There were two issues with this house. One was working not for the final client, but for the developer, not knowing who was going to occupy the house. So again, some of the thinking that's typical of the landscape work, where you want to anticipate multiple possible programs, here was working at a small scale in the house project. The other thing is that these lots were actually fairly small, so that if we were going to get any sense of scale and expansiveness in the house, it had to be operating in the vertical dimension. So you see that here in the central living area, which is really quite small in plan, but has a sense of expansiveness in the vertical direction. That also connects up in our minds with kind of rethinking some of the conventional icons of the house, but not in a literal way, but certainly some sort of nod to the pitched roof, to the local vernaculars, and the iconic presence of the chimney, for example, were things that we were interested in seeing and recontextualizing this particular house. The original brief for the Sacaponic house had a line about more or less traditional roofs, which we read as a kind of code for no flat roofs. But actually, again, because of the compactness of the site and our interest in the icon of the house, it's actually proven to be something that has really persisted in our work, especially in the smaller scale work. So you see that, for example, in this other project for a house. This is a house to be built on the ocean side in the Philippines. As you can see, a very steep lot. And our strategy here, partly a landscape strategy, this idea of developing a kind of platform at the mid-level of the site and organizing all of the public programs of the house at that level, as well as, so you can see the entry and moving down to that lower level, but also, in this case, orienting these roof forms in order to capture the wind and ventilate the house naturally. So there you can see the section with the primary public programs below, and in this case the vent above. And then here the view from the access road with the kind of iconic form of that roof profile, which would really be the primary image of the house from above there. This house is to be built of reinforced concrete with a rain screen of a local wood, which is used in a way, again, without being literal about it, that recalls some of the vernacular architecture of the Philippines. This is probably the smallest project I'm going to show today. This is a house that was finished about 10 years ago, and the existing house is from here over, and we're doing a small addition which will basically be a reconfiguration of the entry and the artist studio for the original client. And I guess the point that I would make here is that what was a kind of feature of the rootscape has actually now become the occupiable studio itself. This is the volume of the studio, and that's the current state of that project, which is also under construction. This is a slightly larger project, but again, like many of these small projects, it has a kind of urban dimension to it. This is the building we finished about a year ago, 18 months ago in Korea. And the context here is a planned community for the book publishing industry about 30 miles north of Seoul, along the river here, river and the highway that border the site. The interesting issue here is this is the model made to describe design guidelines, and you can see the boulevard and what were called the bookshelf typology. This new town has production facilities, distribution facilities, public facilities, but the majority of these buildings are buildings for individual publishing houses that are about typically about 20,000 square feet on these regular lots. And as you can see in the image of the construction, of course, there's not nearly as much regularity as originally imagined in the plan. We actually did a project for this complex about 10 years ago. That project never went forward, and we started design work on this project in about 2007, I believe, on a slightly different site. So, in a way, I mean, again, interesting the way that Asian urbanism works. In this photograph was taken in 2001 when I first visited the site, and when I came back in 2006, 2007, there have been 160 buildings built on site. So I think part of what we were responding to then was how could we both respect the existing design guidelines, give the building some sort of individual identity, but at the same time try and be a little bit quieter, a little bit more restrained than some of the other buildings. So the decision to make a building that's in some ways fundamentally a modernist proposition and trust in the articulation of the surfaces to give the building a kind of individual identity. So you can see the kind of logic here of moving from the site extrusion and then creating respecting the view corridors of the bookshelf typology, which basically said that no more than 50% of the building is lost to the four-story level, but also trying to create a kind of L shape and define a kind of courtyard, which both gave us an exterior public space and a roof garden that would serve for the people working in the building. So this is I guess, in a sense, the back side of the building that faces the constructed wetland. So that photograph was taken looking this way, but here you see that basic L-shaped organization and the roof garden and the courtyard area here. And then this is the boulevard elevation, which is more frontal and has this strong definition of the entry here. Although one of the important things here something we'd like to do with public buildings is that the entry from the boulevard and the entry from the courtyard coincide, and they both bring you right to the center of the building, so that you're not in the sense of penetrating the building from the exterior, but really, again, rather creating almost a kind of continuous exterior landscape at that lower level before you move up into the workspace per se. Then the other thing, we push all of the internal circulation out to the edge of the building, and we peel back the curtain wall as the stairways move up, which gives, as you can see on the right there, a kind of dynamism to the building that's kind of eroded from below. So the sort of conventional curtain wall is sort of undermined by this sense of erosion moving up from below. And then the curtain wall itself is a relatively conventional curtain wall, fairly inexpensive, but the volumes are particularly deep, which then allows us to insert this system of sliding panels with originally a kind of color palette that was kind of coded in a gradated way from the bottom to the top. Ultimately, the client chose to use the colors of the book spine, and sort of with these kind of analogies that these almost look like the ends of books in a bookshelf, which is actually, again, not a bad analogy for the project and a way of codifying its identity as a publishing house. This is a much smaller project, but again a project that works in a very particular way in relationship to the landscape. This is the Chosen Children's Village Chapel in the Philippines, and as you can see, it's a rural site outside of Manila, and the Chosen Children's Village (CCV) is it's a nonprofit organization that takes care of orphans and, in many cases, disabled children. So we were asked to do this small chapel for the organization, which also functions as a kind of marker and as a kind of gateway to their site, because this is the edge of their campus, which mostly extends off to this side, and we occupy a former parking lot that, as you can see here, is really the boundary between the rural landscape and the more controlled landscape of Canada. Now, one of the issues here is that many of the children are in wheelchairs, so there had to be a kind of continuity of those surfaces from inside to outside. So you can see there, for example, the way these big pivot doors just sort of open up and really allow the exterior landscape to move right in. The plan, again, as a diagram, is a single line which is bent back on itself. The cans in the wall perform structurally. It's a high seismic zone, so structural design was actually quite significant here. And that wall folds back on itself, creates the altar here, and the vestry here, the baptistry here, and then the void that's left allows the exterior landscape really to come right in. This is a building, it's really more of a pavilion than a building per se. It has no glass in the windows, it has no mechanical system. When it rains, the rain comes right in, and because the interior surface is an exterior paving, you just sweep the water out. So it's really, it's a building that is performing or functioning to be more like a piece of landscape. Here you can see that paving and the entry doors. It's also a building made of, with the exception of the wood at the entry doors, it's made of a single material. It's all reinforced concrete covered in stucco. Big acacia tree, which we preserved, and you can see the kind of iconic form of the building from the outside, the rhythm of those structural piers. Structural piers are quite deep, nearly 60 centimeters. Again, it's not a necessarily sophisticated piece of structural design, but it really had to resist, and we had to work with the available local technology and work to make the building robust in the recycling zone. But then we take advantage of that depth. There are two series of infill panels on the inside and on the outside with these cuts between, which you guys don't worry about. Yeah. So you can see the way that functions to filter the light, to bring the indirect light down behind the altar, and to define the cross there. And this was actually something we did on a pro bono basis, and it's actually kind of a pleasure to just see the way it's been accepted by the community and very, very heavily used. Also apparently become a favorite place to get married. Very much in demand for weddings. All right. This is the last project I'm going to show. It's last for a number of reasons. It's one of the most recent things we've done. We think it's one of the best things we've done. But it also ties together a lot of the themes of this lecture. It ties together that notion of diagram work. It ties together these preoccupations about part and whole that were fundamentally with the field conditions work. So it's a project that, as we were working on the project, we realized that we were working with a lot of the same principles that I had first articulated in these articles that were written in the middle 1990s. As Isla kindly said, has become rather canonical. This is the Danish translation of the field conditions work, and this is one of the original projects from Points and Lines, where you can see on the one hand the kind of even distribution of parts, the kind of scattering of program elements that creates this kind of open-ended field. But then you also see this what we call interdigitated perimeter, which in this particular case for the library program just really serves to increase the amount of perimeter and to place the reading areas in close proximity to nature. So again, something we realized after the fact is that some of the ideas we were working with in this particular project really harken back to some of those earlier principles. So again, I did show here some of the field conditions diagrams on the right. These were just very quick and simple set of diagrams that were really looking at kind of the graphic equivalent to some of the organizing principles drawn from a number of different sources, from art sources, from architectural sources, known called Market here, the Berger Venice Hospital here, that were really some of the starting points for that field conditions work in 1995. As I said, it wasn't as if we set out to do a field conditions project in 2010, or that we wanted to somehow demonstrate our intellectual consistency. It was rather that as we started looking at the specifics of this particular site, this particular program, those working concepts allowed us to solve some very, very specific issues. This was a competition for a contemporary art museum in the city of Maribor in Slovenia. As you can see from the aerial photograph, it's a pretty intact European city. This was the line of the historic fortification. Our site being just outside is also organized along the Drava River. So in a way, the problem for us was how to resolve the contradiction between the competition demand for a very progressive, forward-looking, contemporary art center with a kind of singular identity. How to reconcile that with the texture and the iconography of the historic city, and in part that appeal to the field conditions and different relationships between the part and whole allowed us to do that. There were also some very simple sectional and architectural decisions. The notion that the lower levels of the building could encompass large-scale public programs and reach out and connect to the city, whereas the kind of iconography of the building, the profile of the building, could in turn recall this very distinctive pitched roof landscape of the existing city. So this is a kind of cleaned up version of one of the first sketches that we made, where you see the notion of lifting the building up to create a series of very open-ended public programs at the ground floor, and then the gallery spaces, which also need a kind of rhythm of structure and walls in order to curate exhibitions, but also lend themselves to that kind of iconic shaping to link back to that roofscape. So this was an old fortification that marked the corner of the wall, and you see the way in which our new profile tries to without being literal about the recall, brings that logic into play. This phrase, non-centralized expansive systems capable of becoming specific at each point, was something that came up in conversation with my friends Emilio Chignon and Luis Mencia, and again, is a kind of restating for me of this notion of field conditions. So an expansive system, the grid, for example, is an expansive system. It's scalable, it can be extended widely, but grids don't become specific at each point. Grids are undifferentiated at all points. So that notion of a search for organizing systems that are expansive and capable of being repeated and extended over the site, yet at the same time are capable of being made very, very specific at individual points, is something that was really motivating this kind of particular response to this project. So these are some of the earlier sketches, and then my colleague and friend Ed Eigen showed me this image. This is the Linnaean diagram, where you have artificial divisions within a continuous landscape of species. This is the sort of archipelago, where you have defined groups of species but no interaction. And obviously these two are the more interesting ones, where you have defined areas, but you have a kind of communication between those zones. That was kind of after the fact version, but it eerily recalls some of our very earliest sketches for the project. So, all right, let me show here one more animation. Yes. Which is really simply a way of describing well, in this case, the underlying structure, which is based on a series of 15 regular pentagons, each one of which is exactly the same in plan, but together make this kind of continuous grid, which allows for the platforms for the galleries. And then, as that form is built up, each one of those pentagons can be deformed very, very loosely to create a highly variable roofscape that, in its aggregate form, can create the kind of new identity for the institution at the same time that it maintains a kind of local measure that both works for the program of the gallery at the same time as it creates an iconic link to the roof forms of the traditional buildings in the historic city. So here is a diagram that's basically explaining that artful relationship, that each of these with an identical footprint but capable of being made space specific, that together create something that has a kind of iconic presence on the site, creating again a kind of complex roof form that's very recognizable as something new, yet recalls the measure and the underlying logic of the traditional block. This is the model that we built in the office, showing that relationship to the site. This is the main museum part. This is the kind of service and educational wing. And there you see it in context. Here's the traditional limit of the traditional city, the riverfront, a market. And the other thing here that's important is to develop then out of this perimeter a series of public spaces that recall the public spaces that grow up in the traditional city that emerge over time out of the kind of fundamental measure of the block. So again, you see that in the model as well in relationship to the square, so that we can begin to create a variety of public spaces on site rather than one large singular space. Or here, the way that the project addresses the riverfront, where the roof form becomes highly iconic. Here you see the lower level that's been lifted up, where the structure becomes much more present. So each one of these pentagonal forms comes down to a single heavy column, but then when you work through the logic of the triangulated geometry, it creates a kind of overall net where, again, the individual unit disappears into this larger structural network at the same time as those moments where it does come down to the ground give you a specific identity to each one. And then that allows the gallery space can be divided both horizontally as well as partitioned, divided vertically as well as partitioned horizontally. So there are moments when we can take advantage of the full height of those pieces, and there are moments where it gets divided up further. So here's the view from underneath, with the kind of continuous lattice of that ceiling, the large columns coming down, and then the galleries above, with in some cases very large overlooks, creating those high double height spaces. Or the way in which then those public spaces can address the waterfront and really create that connection from the waterfront back up to the public spaces. Here, the entry here, kind of street-like condition with a serrated edge to the north, and then kind of continuity from these interior spaces with, for example, all of the cafe functions, creating sort of terraces looking over the water here. So that's the ground floor plan, where again you see the sort of punctuation of those columns coming down, and the kind of continuity of that field, and the tracery of the structural lattice above. That's a view coming up from the water. Concrete structure with a corrugated zinc rain screen, which we pull down to create the mullions of the windows, and the view on the other side, looking out to the city, again, keeping that very open, very porous, at the same time with the strong structural presence of the architecture itself, the kind of transparency out to the public spaces, and the variety of gallery spaces that we're able to achieve out of this logic. One case, kind of exterior space, also voids that go down to the public space, and clear stories up above. So this is one level up, and you can see the way in which in this case, you're less aware of the geometry of the pentagon, but it remains in the courtyard, and it's some structural elements which creates the kind of necessary modularization and measure for those gallery spaces. Our attitude towards gallery space, towards exhibition space, is that you really do have to give curators simple white walls and good, clean spaces to work with. Yet that doesn't mean the architectural presence disappears entirely. So with the double height spaces, with the presence of the clear stories beyond, again, there's a kind of dynamism to the architecture that still leaves the exhibition space itself relatively clean and untouched, so that really the artwork itself can come forward. Then up in the mezzanine level, under those clear stories, there's simply some larger programmatic areas related to administration. But here there are smaller scale works developed. The lower level was intended to be for changing installations, large scale installations of contemporary art. Their permanent collection would be displayed on the upper level, and that tended to be smaller scale works, watercolors, photographs, and smaller paintings. But here you would much more sort of feel the kind of measure and presence of those clear stories above, and the kind of, in a sense that profile from the inside as well as from the outside. And of course, the notion that any building like this really needs to have a kind of full 24-hour public dimension, so that the way in which any new institution will function in the city, and the potential of creating a new public realm at the ground floor at the same time as creating a kind of icon for the new programming on the upper level, and tying back to the historic structure of the city itself. And we do that again by these very artful relationships and dialectic thinking that has had a kind of continuous relationship in our practice now for at least 15 years. Thank you very much.
I saw you earlier with the Chinese characters. The diagrammatic nature of that language, the representational nature of the language, like translate to architecture somehow, or like a code? Could you articulate on that?
It's an interesting question, and I mean, I have to confess there's probably a relationship which I have not completely thought through, partly because I know very little about Asian languages, but I think certainly in this project, and even going back to the houses, in a more general sense, paying attention to the iconic character of the architecture itself. I mean, I think I don't know, you've tried to be very, very loose in my historical references here, that in the period when I was going to school, late 70s, early 80s, and we were, in a sense, working our way out of postmodernism, right? The paradigmatic drawing of postmodernism was the rendered facade, rendered elevation drawing, right? And I think in getting away from postmodernism and returning to questions of organization, of structure, of plan, that was one of the babies we threw out with postmodernist bathwater, right? Is that we were thinking almost exclusively about organization and structure, and elevations were simply meant to be transparent to the internal organization of the building, and nobody paid attention to the kind of iconic figure of the building on the landscape. So I would say in recent years that notion of thinking about also the way in which the silhouette of the building, the vertical plane of the building can communicate information, not necessarily again in the kind of old-fashioned semiotic postmodernist way, but in a way that is one of the most direct and immediate ways in which architecture can communicate, is through either silhouette or elevation. And I think there's been a kind of recovery of that dimension of architecture in recent years, which is certainly and something to do with a pictographic, iconic character, not necessarily of Asian languages, but of architecture itself. Yeah.
To sort of pick up on that, I was actually interested in that the airport project, and I sort of like the way that the logic of the diagram kind of unfolded into these sort of urban ecological zones.
Right.
And then I felt I was wondering how then you place these towers and this bridge, these other programmatic elements that had kind of less relationship to the diagram.
Right.
And I feel there's more of kind of what you were talking about in terms of the image, or is it more intuitive?
Well,
approach, or how do you see that
yeah, in part, I mean, it's the architect trick to say, well, that was the client. I mean, in part, it was essentially kind of symbolic logic that said, I mean, again, the type of gateway is not our name for the project, it's theirs, and the notion that those towers were placed at the northern end of the site in order to function. So but I mean, in a sense, you're right. The diagrammatic logic of the void of the park and then the fabric filling in over time met up with a symbolic logic, which of course was coming from the desires of the city planners and the mayor to have, I mean, politicians love symbols, and so that was driven more by a kind of symbolic logic. So I would say, yeah, it's certainly its presence there on the northern end of the site was a result of that desire for a kind of gateway symbol at the northern end of the site. But if I'd gone into maybe a little more detail in terms of the internal organization of those pieces, I think some of that infrastructural diagrammatic logic is operating as well. But it's more local, it's not part of the overall idea of the project. Yeah.
I think this is related to the slide you showed that was talking about treating slow and small and
Yes.
So are there many strategies we can also learn from the landscape architects who are forced to stay maintained
For sure.
these 10 years, etc. And these big airfields that need 10 or 20 years to initiate or plan urbanism so that there become programs that are needed by small.
Yeah. No, this is very, very important, and I mean, perhaps one of the things about landscape urbanism that I skipped over a little bit quickly. I mean, I think one of the primary lessons that architects sort of can and should learn from landscape is precisely about process. Landscape architects are forced by necessity to think about the life of their project over a very, very long-term time horizon. The yearly maintenance budget for Central Park is something like $100,000 per year per acre, and that money is going to basically maintain a steady state. And I think a lot of the innovative work in landscape architecture is precisely as you described, is saying, how can we use concepts of ecological succession to not just growing in the project in a kind of quantitative way over time, but qualitative changes of state, so that at any given point in its history, it's complete, yet it's also transforming into some other state, which is what large-scale natural landscapes do by themselves, again, over much longer time horizons. But again, I think this is one of the most challenging and interesting theoretical challenges to urbanism and architecture coming from landscape. It's proven difficult to implement. But again, I think as a kind of concept, I mean, this is the famous phrase from Rem Koolhaas that you feed the site with potential. And I think this, to the degree that these ideas are now infiltrating urbanism practices, it's I think one of the most important contributions from that.
In in that regard, would you say that architectural identity shouldn't be singular, but it should continuously evolve and change with the way the system operates? Because you mentioned architectural identity and throughout all the projects.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you see that as a sort of a singular element, as an icon, or is it something that you understand in the process of change?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think, part of the, any site as big as some of these projects we're working on, I mean, it would be a kind of nightmare if it were actually designed by a single architect, right? I mean, what we love about the cities we love is the interplay between individual expression and collective identity. And, architects have wrestled with that problem about, how do you navigate between the individual expression of a particular building and its contribution to some sort of collective notion of the city as a whole. I mean, a lot of the discussions in the 70s and 80s around typology and morphology were directed at these issues. And I think, again, in some of the more strategic approaches to large-scale sites and landscape urbanism, you're beginning to see different approaches to that. My own feeling is, again, if you take the lessons from ecology, and a lot of discussion you hear it in architecture all the time, interest in emergence and self-organization. But any ecologist will tell you that no system self-organizes without highly specific initial input. So in some sense, I think what the job of the architect is to be responsible for that initial structuring in a fairly specific way, such that as a site or a landscape or an urban complex grows in and changes and evolves over time, it's doing so in response to some very, very specific initial information. Now, that's an easy formula to lay out exactly how it gets negotiated in practice. It's difficult, and I think different architects would locate themselves at different places along that spectrum. But I think in general, I think architects, urbanists, landscape architects actually do need to take responsibility for design and recognize that they are going to make some kind of imposition on the site, and that one of the expertises, knowledge that we need to develop better is to understand what forms of organization, what forms of structure allow more room for change and development over time. But it's not an absence of design that makes that happen, but a strong presence of design, in my view. Yeah.
Questions relative to diagrams and notions of chance and unpredictability. It seems like a lot of the early work was really about kind of static diagrams, pictures, fields. Now that you're clearly working in environments that have a much more complex field, what is the capacity for diagrams to kind of take that in a way that, like John Cage, really try to utilize the ideas in work and in their composition. This project, as an example, the range of things that you showed conceptually were still really static. Sure. They were still sketches. There was not that notion of the dynamics that are unpredictable. So, just curious how you, what your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, again, I think in a kind of hypothetical way, I totally agree with you. And if anything, I would identify that as a kind of fundamental property of diagrams. That to me, a diagram is something that generates multiple possibilities and multiple readings, as opposed to something that narrows down the field of possibilities. So that when I talk about buildings that function diagrammatically, in a way, it's that capacity of the building itself to support multiple readings and multiple scenarios over time that's kind of important about that. I think there are, again, it's a little harder in practice to actually implement that, and I think that has to be negotiated, again, with somehow an architect's obligation to fix form. I mean, I think this is, again, part of my interest in infrastructure, for example, that infrastructure is one of those examples of something that is actually designed with a very, very high degree of specificity, but can potentially support multiplicity of programs and events. So it seems to me that there are ways to structure that relationship between specificity and openness, and even to identify specific formal relationships. I mean, you know, the whole the Smithson's preoccupation with map building, for example, was very much in line with this, right? With the notion that the map building organizations allow for a kind of freedom of use and in a kind of unpredictable way over time. Yeah, that didn't necessarily turn out to be so true. You can think of something like the Free University of Berlin. So that's one side of it, right? Is just building up a kind of architectural intelligence about which kinds of organizations, which kinds of diagrams can support a higher degree of unpredictability. The other side of it is that, I mean, Ben Van Berkel and Caroline Voss, for example, they'll no longer talk about the diagram, but about a design model. Design model is fundamentally a three-dimensional diagram, because most of the diagrams I showed were two-dimensional graphic instruments. With Ben and Caroline, for example, the sort of Mobius diagram that is at the basis of their Mercedes-Benz Museum is something they would call a design model. And that is, in their mind, at least intended to be a sort of more robust, more fully three-dimensional version of the diagram. Also, I mean, at the risk of, opening up another discussion, another debate, I think that some of the questions around scripting, I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical of the formal results of a lot of parametric work and computer-driven work, but it seems to me that the scripts necessarily work through the logic of the diagram, and because of that ability now to work at the level not of the final form, but of the code itself, to work at the level of the algorithm, seems to me that also could potentially open up to some really interesting and looser relationships between the diagram and the formal results.